Hi, Bill Fortier, CTV News. Can you tell me, as of today, how much consideration are you giving to scrapping the LAV deal with Saudi Arabia?
The Prime Minister was, the Prime Minister had some important comments about that. The murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and we now know that he was murdered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, is really horrific. It's something that Canada is gravely concerned by, and the explanations that Saudi Arabia has offered to date are not consistent and they are not credible. It is very important for Canada to continue to press for a credible and transparent investigation, and it's essential for us that those responsible, including at the very highest levels, be held to account and face justice. It's worth pointing out Canada right now has the presidency of the G7, and we have been working very hard in coordination with our G7 partners to have a shared response. We put out a G7 statement last Tuesday, and we put out a G7 statement today. I'd like to draw your attention to the statement itself. Please take a look. And there was a key element in it, which is the G7 collectively have said that Saudi Arabia must put in place measures to ensure that something like this can never happen again. That's important. I spoke today with Jeremy Hunt, the Foreign Secretary of Great Britain, and also with the Foreign Minister of the Netherlands. So we're coordinating closely with our allies. On the LAVs, as the Prime Minister said, I think there are a lot of Canadians asking a lot of questions about military exports to Saudi Arabia. It is something our government is looking into. Yesterday, the Prime Minister convened a meeting of the incident response group to discuss the Khashoggi situation. And as the Prime Minister said today, Canada has in the past frozen export permits over human rights concerns, and we are very prepared to do that in the future. So we're looking at this closely. Stay tuned.
Thank you very much for that. Just as a follow-up, what is that point? What would it take when the moral responsibility of Canada to defend human rights outweighs the business needs of the country? Is it if we find that Saudi Arabia is responsible for the death of Khashoggi?
I think it's clear that Saudi Arabia is responsible for the death of Jamal Khashoggi. Jamal Khashoggi was murdered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. That is now established as a fact. We have more questions, and they need to be answered about who was responsible for his murder, and we need to hold Saudi Arabia to account. And I do want to be clear that Canada will insist that responsibility be borne at the very highest levels, if necessary, for this horrific event. It is, you guys are all journalists. I used to be a journalist. It's important. I mean, important is too weak a word. It is essential that journalists in Canada and around the world be able to do their work without fear of their lives. That is a key principle for Canada. It's a key principle for democracy. There is also a very worrying element of extraterritoriality here. I spoke with the Turkish foreign minister on Sunday, my second conversation with him in the past 10 days, and we're very mindful that this happened in Turkey, and they are an important party in this terrible crime.
Hi, Larry Guerrero, CBC News. Just again on the...
Can you speak up, because there's a lot of...
Is that a little better? There we go. Again, on the Khashoggi case, I understand what you're saying about we know now that they were responsible for his death. Saudi Arabia, this is not the first incident, though, where human rights have been an issue there. Should Canada, a country, and certainly your government, that prides itself on being a champion of human rights, is this a deal that should have been made in the first place? Is this a deal that should have been canceled before this?
So you're quite right that our government believes that human rights and speaking up for human rights around the world needs to be part of Canada's foreign policy. I hope you guys all agree. I mean, I think that this is something that Canadians, is a view widely held by Canadians. As I think Canadians know, our government has talked the talk on this and walked the walk on this. We have been clear both in private and in public with Saudi Arabia about our concerns on human rights, and that became a matter of, I think, some international attention in August. So we are going to speak up on human rights, and we're proud to do it. It's essential. When it comes to the LAVS contract, this was not a contract that was entered into by our government. In terms of exports going forward, as the Prime Minister said today, Canadians are asking questions about whether it is appropriate given the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. We think those are important questions. The government is considering this issue very carefully and very seriously. That's why the Prime Minister convened the Incidents Response Group to meet early yesterday morning. We are looking into the contract, and as the Prime Minister said both yesterday and today, we have frozen export permits over human rights concerns, and we are prepared to do so going forward.
Just again to follow up on that, you've mentioned that there are questions. You've also pointed out quite rightly that we actually have quite a few answers right now about what happened. There's not a lot of mystery about what happened at this point. So how can this deal go forward with a regime like this in a way that is not, frankly, hypocritical, if considering our position on the importance of human rights around the world?
I want to kind of quibble with the first part of the question, just to say from our perspective, there are still some very important questions about Jamal Khashoggi's murder that do need to be answered. It's important that his body be found, and crucially, it's important to establish the political responsibility for his death. So we have some important questions that still need to be asked and answered, and I don't think you were disagreeing with that, but I want to say very clearly that Canada, a key priority for Canada is a clear, transparent, and credible negotiation. In terms of the arms exports, the Prime Minister was very clear today that we think there are serious questions to be asked. We are looking into the situation very thoughtfully. We're looking into the specific LAVS contract very thoughtfully. We are prepared, and we have in the past frozen export permits over human rights concerns, and we're prepared to do so going forward.
Sorry, do you happen to know the number of how much Canada has received so far from this contract? How much money?
I happen to know it, but I happen not to be able to say it right now.
Why not?
There are some issues around the commercial. There are some commercial issues around the contract that mean I need to be a little bit careful what I say today around the specifics on the contract.